Hi, I'm Austin Wintory, and today I'm going to go under the hood on the score to Eternal Strands, a brand new game from a brand new studio called Yellow Brick Games. Working with this team has been an absolute privilege. It was new friends and old friends both, and the mission, as set forth by our creative director Mike Laidlaw, was to try to find a way to avoid the kind of Renaissance Faire-esque neo-medieval cliches that run a lot through the fantasy genre. This is a very high fantasy game, but it's also kind of a positive and optimistic game with a lot of bright colors and a sort of joyousness to it. And so he said, you know, what new life can we bring to this genre musically? So I spent a few years trying to figure that out. So here's just a little snippet where I offer up some of what I came up with, and hopefully you find it interesting. Thanks so much. All right, as you can imagine, given that we're still out ahead of the release of the game, I'm going to have to be a little bit sparing in what I share. So I thought, how about the least spoilery thing possible, the opening cinematic of the game, because it gives a little bit of a taste of some of the principles at work. All right, I'm going to hit play and unpack a little bit of what we hear at the beginning. First things first, that's hopefully, pretty obvious, is we have a big French horn solo, beautifully played by the principal French hornist there in Nashville, who she always does an absolutely phenomenal job. So it's a pretty standard and straightforward treatment. This score features quite a bit of brass in the big boss battles, and I wish I could get into today how crazy some of the treatment of that is. That just gives you a sense of that nice, lush, regal sort of sound. This was recorded on its own in Nashville, as I mentioned. Now, in contrast, if I play that again, but I remove that French horn, you can kind of get a sense of what's left behind. So there is a style of Japanese pottery called Kintsugi that's quite famous. You probably have heard of it. And the underlying principle of this is that a piece of pottery, after being destroyed and subsequently repaired, is hopefully more beautiful than it was prior to being broken. And so the technique involves this beautiful golden sort of threading of the pieces back together. And so I wanted to kind of adopt this idea as an underlying principle of the score. One of the mandates from Mike Laidlaw, our creative director, was to kind of unpack a different way of doing fantasy and not just lean on, what he called Renaissance Faire tropes, but the idea of music that just sounds like neo-medieval kind of Hollywood cliches for a fantasy environment. In no small part because, as you'll see him say when he talks about the game, there's supposed to be a kind of lightheartedness and an even joyous quality to Eternal Strands. So the music needed to come from a different sort of place than something dark and heavy like Lord of the Rings or sort of medieval like you hear from so much other kind of high fantasy. And on top of that, there's this narrative conceit of them being in the Enclave, which is a world that's been sort of sealed off by magic. And since this is something that's been sort of broken by way of its separation from the rest of the world, I found myself thinking about Kintsugi and going, what if the whole score was built with that in mind as a kind of homage to the environment of the score? It's almost like an extension of environmental storytelling. So I am constantly breaking things apart and then forcibly putting them back together. Now, sometimes this is quite literal. So to give you an example, one of the very first sounds that you hear at the beginning of this is a kind of pulsing guitar. So if I play that on its own, you can hear it like this. So it's a very simple little guitar part played by my friend Tom Straley. We did a kind of custom build where he took one of his guitars and took out all the strings, and then we alternated every other string on it to be of a different material, so that the thing kind of felt like it was almost put together in a junkyard. Because that had a way of sort of approximating this Kintsugi quality. On top of that, then threaded pieces of paper through the strings and also other guitar strings. So you end up with this kind of lattice work that sounds quite crazy. On top of that, I then put plugins to do things like selectively take snippets of the audio and randomly play them backward in tandem with the forward signal flow, that sort of thing. If I jump to a slightly later part of the piece, you can actually hear this in a slightly more representative way. You can hear the buzz from all the sympathetic vibration of the strings woven in there. So this is one of the things we start with. On top of that, we also have this beautiful traditional sort of string orchestra that is just sustaining chords underneath the French horn. Now, it's overall fairly naturalistic, but tucked in there, for example, if I isolate a stereo mixdown of our wides on either side of the string orchestra as recorded in Nashville, you can hear what that's doing is that's taking a small snippet of the audio and playing it backwards while the rest of it simultaneously plays forward. So you can hear how it's sort of jittering backwards as the form of reverb tail. And if you listen to, for example, right next to it, the tree mics directly above the conductor's podium, these are natural with just traditional reverb passing through them. On top of that, we had some more fun. I went to London to Air Studios about a year before going to Nashville and recorded a whole bunch of custom textures and things like that with a different group of strings. And so that I was able to end up with things that became our stand-in for traditional electronics, because I thought, well, I don't want to lean into a kind of deliberately anachronistic anti-fantasy by having a bunch of synths. But what could be interesting is if we found ourselves constantly sort of mangling the audio in the way that we're physically mangling the instruments. Here's an example of the kinds of sounds that were created there that serve as a background part on the later string orchestra. It's sort of natural, but not entirely. And then mix that with some of these other, where I had the strings constantly do things like reattacking notes out of sync with each other. So you get this kind of undulating, again, sort of Kintsugi-inspired brokenness. So it's like a synth pad, but it's obviously built entirely out of acoustic natural elements. And then here, I just shamelessly pitch bend it because it ends up functioning like a bass drop, but it's entirely the manipulated sound of the acoustic strings recorded in London. Now we mix that with another couple layers of that have been heavily processed, and you get a sound like this. So nothing in there is explicitly a synth or electronic. It's all just the manipulation of the sound. Here's another element I want to talk about. I had custom made this giant kalimba, which is an African instrument. Working with my fabulous assistant Shireen, I made a kind of giant library of strange sounds. So like here, for example, she was bending the little tines on the kalimba using a pair of scissors, and you get this kind of texture, which I have... you can hear that passing through this wonderful, weird plugin called Backmask, which takes chunks of the audio and reverses it periodically. Here's one other little ingredient I want to tease out, which is I did quite a lot of recording with my regular trusted partner, Kristen Nagus, who is sort of my woodwind partner in crime. We work together all the time. She's phenomenal. And she had bought this absolute monstrous sub-bass recorder, which you can see here. I took a little snippet of and have that just pumping through as a nice kind of low, heavy gesture. It's like a foghorn. So that sort of thing is used all throughout as well. So when you combine all of that, you end up with the first 40 seconds or so that sound like this. All right, so there's literally less than 1 minute of this multi-hour score that I've spent years writing, but I hope it sounded interesting to you. Thanks again, Save and Sound, for inviting me, and to Yellow Brick Games for including me in this incredibly special project, Eternal Strands. Thanks so much.